Hello, so my name is Paulcroft. I have a story to tell. It's a kind of a dark story at the beginning, but it has a very good ending to it. My story is called Three Miracles. It's about three miracles that I actually witnessed or experienced. And actually, there's a fourth miracle that I always throw in because there was four miracles that actually did occur. I've told this story many times at different churches across Manitoba, starting into Saskatchewan as well. But I've been told that I should record the story, so that's what I'm doing today. So we'll start with it at this point. So as I said, the story is called Three Miracles, but I will throw in that bonus miracle for you as well. The story begins in 2014. I was sentenced to a year in Regina Provincial Correction Centre. With time off for good behaviour, I should have served 7 months or 8 months, but I actually ended up getting an extra month off, which is something that rarely happens. So I ended up serving 7 months in jail. About halfway through the sentence, I met a pastor in the church, a Seventh-day Adventist pastor. It was through a local pastor that my wife had been connected to. We were not Seventh-day Adventist at that time, but my wife Judy had begun going to a Seventh-day Adventist church without my knowing. She'd made arrangements through her pastor that she'd met to have a pastor come in to visit me. Developed a really good relationship with him, but I told him in no uncertain terms that there was no way I was going to become a Seventh-day Adventist because there was too many don'ts. So I was released from jail in November 2014, and my wife first convinced me to go to Winnipegosis Seventh-day Adventist Church and then to Dauphin Seventh-day Adventist Church. We did split our time between the two at first, but eventually we decided to stick with Dauphin Seventh-day Adventist Church, and that's where we are these days. That's Seventh-day Adventist, or that's Dauphin on the picture there in front of you. Not long after I got out of jail, February 14th, 2015, my wife was baptized into the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but I was still not convinced. In 2016, Judy and I attended White Sands Bible Camp, and we went down to the beach where the baptisms took place. And at the baptisms, the pastor who came to visit me in jail baptized his daughter and brought tears to my eyes as I watched it happen. We went for supper in the cafeteria, and I told my wife we had to talk. In July of 2017, I was baptized at White Sands by my local pastor and the pastor who had visited me in jail. So never say never. I became an active member of the Dauphin Church. I presented sermons. I became an elder in training. I was part of the Bible study and felt like I was really growing in the church every day. Still had a lot to learn, but we all do. But I was really enjoying being part of the church. But in August 2019, everything changed. I disappeared from the front of the church, and I disappeared from the church completely. In Job 1:1 we read, "There was a man in the land of Uz, whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and evil." Now please don't get me wrong, I am not equating myself with Job in any way, but Job was put through a challenge that God allowed, and I believe that God did the same thing with me. So as I said, in July 2019, we attended Camp White Sands. It's become a bit of a tradition for us. We enjoyed the relaxation, the learning, the spending time with like-minded people. I took part in the 5-kilometer fun run. Yeah, that's me in all my sun-bleached glory. I wasn't one to exercise, but my job hauling grain kept me busy, and I was relatively healthy. But just a few short weeks later, in August 2019, life had changed completely, and I was lying in a hospital bed, paralyzed, and fighting for my life. I have an illness called Guillain-Barré syndrome, or GBS, and while there's no cure, it is controlled for the most part. It's a rare autoimmune disorder that attacks the myelin sheath that protects the nerves. It causes the nerves to short circuit, similar to if you remove the insulation from around an electrical cord. Messages from the brain do not reach the intended destination, causing weakness and paralysis. So while I could tell my fingers and toes to move, they didn't respond. It has many causes, including recovering from a serious stomach flu or an infection, recent surgeries, some vaccines, or some sort of bacterial infection. But I had none of these. The cause of my illness was never determined. There are a number of different variants to GBS that have differing effects on the body. The variant that I had was extremely rare, and at the time, only 32 cases have been reported worldwide. Having a rare illness is one thing, but having an extremely rare variant of a rare illness is something extra, and not in a good way. So I told you that my story is called Three Miracles, and it does have the bonus miracle as well. But we'll talk about that in a little while. But first I want to tell you about the first miracle. While I was in hospital, I kind of met a woman named Marguerite. Marguerite was brought into hospital in the bed next to mine, separated by the curtain, the same night that I arrived in hospital. She came into the room next to me. All I could hear was a lot of mumbling and groaning, but not very much life out of her at all. And because there was only a curtain separating us, you could hear pretty much everything that was happening. Marguerite had come in. She'd had a stroke that morning. Her husband was out at the local coffee shop. And when he came home, she wasn't up out of bed, which was very, very unusual. So him and his son-in-law were sitting around the table having another coffee when they heard a thump from upstairs, and it was Marguerite falling out of bed. I rushed upstairs to see what was happening. Marguerite was rushed to hospital. She was life-flighted into Winnipeg to the Health Sciences Centre with a massive stroke. Overhearing what was going on with the father and the daughter, that Marguerite was not doing well and was not expected to survive. Eventually I did get to sleep, hard to sleep in the hospital, but in the morning, when they were dealing with Marguerite, I could sort of start to hear her interacting a little bit more with the nurses. And instead of just mumbles and grumbling, she was actually giving single-word answers. When her daughter arrived later on, she was asking Mum how she was feeling. And she was getting answers from her mum, and it was amazing to hear this transition. Later on in the day, they got Marguerite sitting up in her bed. Throughout the day, she improved. The next day, they got her up walking, and the following day, she was discharged. Now, I never really got to meet Marguerite, but I did hear her daughters over and over and over again talking to her mum, and I'd heard the name of her daughter. So as they were packing up to leave, I called her daughter over. And I said to her daughter, I said, I'm really sorry for intruding. I said, but I heard what was happening with your mum. I said, the curtain's very, very small. And I did hear that she wasn't expected to survive. And I said, I'm really, really amazed that she survived. And she says, we are too. And I said, I did something that I'd never done for Marguerite, that I'd never done for anybody else prior to that. And I said a prayer for somebody that I didn't know. And I said, I hope that your mum does well. And she says, well, we were listening to your story as well, because, as you said, the curtains are very small. And she says, it sounds like you've got a really hard road ahead of you. And at that time, I didn't know actually how hard of a road I had. So we go back to Job. In Job 1:8 we read that the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there's none like him on the earth? He's blameless and an upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil. So even though Job feared God and shunned evil, Satan felt that he could change him. As we look further into the first chapter of Job, we read that Satan, through a series of events, took away Job's oxen, asses, servants, sheep and camels, and even Job's sons and daughters. And what did Job do? He worshipped God. In Job 1:20 we see that Job arose and tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell to the ground and worshipped God. Job had lost everything, and yet he still worshipped God. When I was in hospital and feeling really down with nothing positive ahead, that is exactly what I did. I worshipped God. But Satan wasn't finished with Job yet. Job was struck down with boils from his head to his toes, and yet his faith never faltered. His wife and friends attempted to turn him from the Lord, but he remained strong. And in the end of the book of Job, we find out that through his faith he was blessed with great wealth and flocks and many sons and daughters, which were the most beautiful in all the land. Job lived a long and fruitful life and saw 4 generations below him. Faith in God does marvelous things. So miracle number 2 is Phil's story. Phil came into hospital before I did. And Phil had an illness very, very similar to mine, but a little bit of a different variant. He had chronic inflammatory dehydrating polyneuropathy. Now, we never say that again, so it's actually called CIDP. But it is very related in that it destroys the myelin sheath in the same way. But it's a chronic illness that Phil will have to have injections of IVIG, which I'll tell you about a little while later, for the rest of his life on about a 3 weeks to a month basis. So before I actually met Phil, I heard all about him. Phil had been in the hospital unit that I'd been in before I was. He actually surprisingly looked very similar to me, and because of that, occasionally the nurses would call me Phil instead of Paul, and it's Paul. And I couldn't actually talk for some of that time, but they would call me Phil, and then they would correct and call me Paul. So eventually, both Phil and I gave permission to have our stories exchanged, and so I did hear more and more about Phil. So when I was transferred to the rehab center, my very first night in the rehab center, I was laying in my bed, and I was in a 4-bed unit, which I will tell you about as we go along here. But I was in a 4-bed unit, and I had my hands up behind my head, laying back in my bed. And this man came in with a walker, walked to one of the other beds, and was talking to one of the other gentlemen in the room. And as he left, I just said, "Hi, how are you doing?" And he says, "I'm good." And I said, "Well, I'm doing okay." I said, I wish I was doing better." He says, "Well, when I came in here," he says, "I couldn't even put my hands behind my head." And something clicked with me, and I said, "What's your name?" And he said, "My name's Phil." And I said, "Phil, I am Paul." So we developed a friendship at that point for the remainder of time that he was in hospital and beyond. And he filled me in a little bit more on his story, and Phil's story is a lot worse than mine. Phil was paralyzed from the forehead down. So when Phil could not open or close his eyes. So when Phil's eyes were opened, they stayed open. When Phil's eyes were closed, they stayed closed. He would lie in bed with his eyes closed for 3 months without any contact with the outside world, without really being able to talk to anybody, without being able to acknowledge anybody. And I said to Phil, I said, "What kept you going through those days when you couldn't communicate?" And he said, "I talked to God." And that was the first link that Phil and I had together, because we have a massive faith in God. And that's how he got through his story. When Phil left the hospital, he wasn't quite in as good shape to go home as I was. I was very lucky in my recovery, again, as we'll talk later. But the miracle is that Phil, at one point, the doctor said to his wife, "I don't think he's going to make it." And Phil heard that. And Phil fought, and through the strength, his faith in God, and through his strength, and what the doctors gave to his, or what God gave to his doctors, Phil was able to survive. And that's miracle number 2. But my story gets a lot longer. So at the time that I got sick, just after we'd been at camp, I was a long distance truck driver. I was hauling grain for a local grain company. On the Tuesday, before I ended up in hospital, it actually started on Friday. On the Friday before I went in hospital, I felt a pain in my hip. It kept me awake most of the night on Friday, so we ended up not going to church on Saturday. We do go to worship on Saturday. So I didn't sleep good, so we didn't go to church. On Sunday, we decided to go to my sister-in-law's wedding anniversary, but I really wasn't feeling good. There was something wrong, something felt weird in my body. On Monday, it was a long weekend, so I didn't have to work, so I spent most of that day on the couch. And then on Tuesday when I woke up, I felt weird. There was something weird about my feet. I always tell people that it felt like my feet and my legs were wrapped in saran wrap. But being a man, I decided that I had to go off to work. So I got in my truck and I drove. And I was on my way to Saskatoon, just outside Saskatoon, with a load of corn to deliver. And about halfway to Saskatoon, I realized that I think I'd kind of made a mistake. I really wasn't feeling good. My legs felt worse. I felt weak. But I got back in my truck and drove to Saskatoon. Got to the place where I unloaded. Called my dispatcher and told him I really wasn't feeling good. And that I think I need to see a doctor. Well, that message never made it through, so I unloaded my load of corn, and they sent me off to pick up another load, a load of canola going up into northern Saskatchewan. So I went to pick up that, and I could not climb up on top of my truck to open the tarps on my truck. So I asked the farmer, and the farmer had his son go up there and open them and close them. And I really wasn't feeling good. Drove that evening, parked that evening, felt absolutely terrible, felt really weak, had a very poor night's sleep. Woke up in the morning, phoned my boss and told him, and he says, well, when you unload that load, we're going to give you a couple hours off to rest. And I said, no. I said, it's more than a couple hours off. I said, I feel absolutely terrible. So got to the place, unloaded my load of canola. Really had a hard time doing any physical work at all. I was completely exhausted. By this time, they had booked me a load that was going to get me back into Manitoba so I could park my truck. My wife was going to come and pick me up. And when she did, she took me to Brandon Hospital. Brandon Hospital, we got there really late at night. It took forever to get in. They told me that I had a viral infection, drink lots of water, and go home. This was Wednesday evening, early Thursday morning by this time. So I was very weak. I hadn't slept, so my wife drove home from Brandon. We got home about 6:30 in the morning on Thursday morning. I spent all of Thursday in bed. Friday morning I got up and I could barely move at all. So my wife phoned my doctor. I phoned the health links. The doctor told me to come in. Health Links told me to go to emergency. Emergency was the better choice. So we drove off to emergency on August 9th, me thinking that I was going to go in, get a shot, have a few tests, and I would be coming home. Little did I know that I was going to spend a long time in hospital. We got to hospital in Dauphin. The Dauphin hospital was under construction at that point, and the main entrance was closed. The emergency entrance was at the back of the hospital. The emergency was at the front of the hospital. Somehow I managed to walk that long distance to the front of the hospital. When I got to the desk, I was completely exhausted, out of breath. They thought I was having a heart attack, but they got me into a wheelchair, settled me down, and I sat and waited and drank my water because I was being told to drink my water. Well, obviously, if you drink too much water, what goes in has to come out. So eventually I asked to use the restroom. So they rolled me over with the wheelchair to the restroom, gave me a urinal to use, but me being the strong person that I am and the stubborn person that I am, decided that I did not need that urinal, which was it's a portable urinal that you hold. But just as the nurse was closing the door, I went to stand up from the wheelchair and my legs buckled. I fell to the ground. Luckily, the nurse heard that, sent out a emergency code for help, and people rushed to the bathroom to help me. That eventually got me into the emergency room a lot quicker. I think until that point there was just kind of a number on the desk, but with the bathroom incident, they did got me in. They ran a bunch of tests, took some blood, told me they didn't know what it was, and they tried to send me home for the night. So when they tried to send me home, I said I cannot move. I can't move, I can't walk, I can't do anything, and I have 3 steps to climb to get into my house. So this was on a Friday afternoon. They did find me a bed to stay in, but really they didn't do a lot with me through the weekend besides take my blood pressure and feed me. Now, before I went into hospital, I had an intense fear of needles. Absolute fear of needles. I'd actually fainted once when I was having blood work done. So when Monday rolled around, it was time to figure out what was wrong with Paul. So they took a lot of blood from me. And when I say they took a lot of blood, I mean a lot of blood. At one point, they took 20 vials of blood from me, testing me for everything from HIV, AIDS, hepatitis, and anything else under the sun. None of them came back positive. Eventually, they gave me a spinal tap, which is the test for GBS, which is what Judy and I had suspected for quite a while. They ran the test. It came back positive that I had GBS, and so now they could begin the treatment. The treatment for initially for GBS is something called intravenous immunoglobulin, or IVIG, which I told you about earlier. It's a injection that they give, or it's a treatment that they give you over the space of a few hours. It's really tiring. It takes a lot out of you. It gave me massive headaches, but it was supposed to stop the progression of the GBS. Unfortunately, it does not always work. It started to remove it a little bit, but when GBS decided to take hold, it came back with a vengeance. There was also a lot of pain, even though eventually I was paralyzed. My body was starting to fall apart. I was getting more and more paralyzed. I lost the use of my legs first, and I started to lose the use of my hands. Even though I could not feel anything on the outside of my body, I could certainly feel pain on the inside of my body, and the pain continued for most of my time in hospital. But at one point I was given morphine. I was given morphine only one time in hospital. I will never have morphine again. That morphine incident caused me to wake up and found myself stuck to the ceiling floating in my bed. Now I know it sounds silly. Obviously I wasn't floating in my bed, but I certainly felt like I was. It was a terrifying experience, and I will never have morphine again. So as I said, I started to feel better. This was August 9th. I'd gone into hospital. They gave me the IVIG. I started to feel better, but then not long after, it very quickly took back hold again. And my wife's birthday is on August 13th, so you can see that the time difference between the 9th to the 13th is just a short distance. And on the 13th, my wife was feeding me because I couldn't use my hands. I still had use of my hands, but they were very weak. And we had a good cry, and I said to my wife, I cannot go on. I can't do this. I give up. And we had a really good cry about it. We said a lot of prayer. And at that point, after getting through that, I said I was never going to give up again. Now, my wife says at one point I did. I honestly do not remember ever giving up again. So eventually, Dauphin Hospital, a very small hospital, decided that they could not treat me. I needed to go elsewhere, and it's a good thing that I did. I was transferred to the Health Sciences Centre in Winnipeg, which is a 4-hour drive. Got into an ambulance. Along the way, just as we were inside of Winnipeg, we got into a minor accident with the ambulance. The ambulance touched mirrors with another vehicle. Obviously, they had to pull over to the side of the road, delayed me getting into Winnipeg even more. And then when I actually arrived in Winnipeg, I was taken into the emergency room in Health Sciences Centre pretty quickly. But I stayed there for the longest time, and the reason was they could not find my paperwork. They knew who I was, they knew where I'd come from, they knew actually where I was going, but they couldn't actually get me there until they could find my paperwork. They searched all over the hospital. They searched my bed. They searched everywhere looking for this paperwork, and they could not find it. And it was a number of hours later, there was a shift change, and one of the aides lifted up a blanket that was sitting on a table and said, "Oh, is this what you're looking for?" and held up my paperwork that had been in my room the whole time. I ended up getting into the unit. Very, very late. I'd missed supper. I hadn't eaten since breakfast that morning. They did find me some peanut butter and jam sandwiches that somebody had to hand feed me, which was the story of my life for the next little while. So I did eventually get a room at the Health Science Centre. That's where I ran into Marguerite. I was always uncomfortable. Even though I could not feel anything on the outside of my body, I could still feel pain. And all the pressure points on my body, my heels, my elbows, my shoulders, all those parts of my body that stick out would feel pain. So they would wrap me in pillows to try and keep me from developing bed sores and to keep the pain from those sections of my body. The other thing that was happening was my kidneys were not working. I was obviously cathetered, so they had a catheter in there and a bag hanging at the end of my bed. And because my kidneys were not working, somehow I was producing 200 times more the normal protein of a normal person. This protein was coming out in my urine into a bag, and the bag was brown and lumpy, which is something that should not be happening. And as people walked by my bed, whether they be doctors, patients, or visitors, they would all stop and look at that bag because I guess it looked really, really bad. One of the other things that I went through was this extreme burning in my body. If the bed was moved and it was stopped in the wrong place, my stomach would feel like it was on fire. It was this gasoline feeling, and it was absolutely terrible feeling. I can't explain it. It is unable to be explained, but it was extreme burning. So I was in Health Sciences Centre in Winnipeg, away from my wife. My wife, we live 4 hours from Winnipeg, so my wife wasn't able to be there all the time. But we had met a pastor at camp. His name was Pastor Maxey, and a very, very wonderful person. He asked me if there was anything that he could pray for. And I said yes. I said, can you pray that I get my hands back? Because I've lost use of my hands, and I really want my hands back. So he held my hand and we prayed for the use of my hands. And a few days later, which I'll tell you about in a bit, I lost the use of my voice, and I was lying in bed that time thinking we should have prayed for my voice. But no, if I get my hands back, I can learn to talk with my hands. I can learn to do many, many other things with my hands. If I've got my voice, all I can do is talk. So I covered myself on that. So Judy came to visit me. I was getting worse and worse, and there was one night she was feeding me, and just as she put a spoonful of rice up to my mouth, I took a breath and sucked the rice into my throat, and I choked. And I choked really, really badly, and I could not cough. I didn't have enough strength in my lungs to cough that rice out. And I choked and choked and choked. Eventually, I was able to breathe, but that rice was still stuck in my throat. I know it was there. I could feel it there, but I could not cough it out, and nobody could help me to cough it out. I was supposed to be being moved to another unit because they felt that I was at the point where I didn't need to be in this extreme high observation unit. But with the coughing and the choking, it did not make sense to move me to this other unit. But they did so eventually anyways, when they thought that the coughing was over and the choking was over. So I was moved late at night to this new unit, and I was put into a unit with 3 other beds. They settled me in. I had a device hooked to my head, right next to my head, to help me to push the call button if I needed to, because I couldn't push it with my fingers. There was no other way of pushing a call button. So they pulled the curtain closed, turned the lights out, and I immediately had a panic attack, and I couldn't breathe, and I was absolutely terrified. I went to push the button with my head, and I could not push the button. I could not get enough strength in my neck to push that button. I couldn't make enough noise because of the rice that was stuck in my throat that any of my bedmates would hear me or roommates would hear me. So I just kept panicking and panicking. Eventually, luckily, I was able to get that button to push, or else I think I would have died at that point. Nurses came in, asked me what was wrong. As soon as they turned the light on, I was okay. And so they left the light on. I may have got a little bit of sleep that night, I'm not sure. But things were really, really going downhill fast. In the morning, they came in, they looked at me, decided that they needed to take me back upstairs to the unit that I was in, where there was more observation instead of being in this 4-bed ward, which was lucky. And when I got up there, it was not much longer that they decided that I needed to be taken to the ICU because I was getting worse and worse. I was rushed to the ICU. I was given I was intubated, and my wife was told that it was very, very close as to whether they made it to the ICU or not. They really just made it in time, and I think it's very, very lucky, but we'll leave it in the hands of God again. So this picture was taken when I was intubated. I was really in rough shape, as you can see. I was paralyzed completely from the neck down. I couldn't breathe. I was on a ventilator, and I was extremely scared. But you can't stay like this. Being intubated is very unhealthy. It's unhealthy for the mouth. It's unhealthy for the vocal cords. It's unhealthy for the throat. It's just basically unhealthy. So they decided that they wanted to do a tracheotomy, which is the hole in the neck. And I was absolutely terrified of having a tracheotomy. And I actually could not make that decision to have the tracheotomy. Somehow I communicated to Judy that it was her decision. Judy decided that I was going to have the tracheotomy. It was the best choice. And the tracheotomy was done. And it was actually the best thing to do, because at that point I could then begin to mouth my words, so the nurses and everybody could read my lips, and I could begin to communicate again, which was really, really good. One of the other things that happened was I lost a lot of weight. I went into the hospital weighing about 180 pounds when they suddenly realized how much the weight I was losing, I was down to about 138. They went into panic mode, and decided that they needed to increase my weight so that I would get the weight back on. And they went into multi-feeding, where they were giving me 3 full meals a day through my feeding tube. And then they were giving me supplements as well to make sure that that I would put on weight. When I eventually could eat, I was also eating 3 full meals a day. So basically, they decided to put the weight on. By the time I came out of hospital, I was weighing over 210 pounds, which is the highest weight I ever weighed in my life. Now I'm back down to about 190, which is a really good place to be. So I talked about the prayer of my hands. The first thing that came back on my body was my hands. And we'd said this prayer for my hands. And my fingers started to come back, my hands started to come back, and eventually I could pick up a phone. And I could communicate with people using my phone, sending them notes, sending them messages. And the doctors and the nurses were amazed at how quick I'd recovered with the use of my hands, because it was not normal to have the use of my hands back so quickly. But it all goes back to that prayer. Pastor Max, he had prayed for my hands. God had heard that prayer, and I'd got my hands back. So now I've already told you about a bonus miracle. So the bonus miracle is one called Judy's Guardian Angel. So family is never... Things happen in families, and Judy was staying with a relative, and there was some negative things that had happened. And Judy's diabetic, and she came to visit me it was the Thanksgiving Monday. She came to visit me, and she hadn't eaten, but she'd taken her insulin, and she came in with our youngest son, and she was heading home that day, and I said, before you leave Winnipeg, I said, you make sure that you go and get something to eat. So she assured me she would. And so she left the hospital, and I figured that was it until she got home. I would get a phone call from her. Well, I didn't get a phone call from her right away, or I did get a phone call, but when I answered the phone, she didn't answer. I could hear background noises, but I thought, okay, well, whatever. So I hung up the phone, and then I immediately did a Find My iPhone on her, because I can track her phone. And she had missed the exit where she was supposed to be, and I could see that it didn't look like the car was moving anymore. So I called back to her phone, and she answered it, but she was really, really slurring her speech and not talking. And I heard in the background, is that your husband? And she said yes, and this person said, give me the phone. And so this stranger starts talking to me on the phone, and she says, does your wife have any medical conditions? I said, yes, she's diabetic. I said, and she hasn't eaten anything today, and she's extremely low sugar. And so this woman told me that she was on the Perimeter Highway, which is the highway that goes around Winnipeg. It's a major highway, high speed, and Judy had stopped in the passing lane of the highway. Judy thought she was off to the side, but she did not know where she was. So this woman had been driving along. She'd seen this car stopped in the middle of the highway, thought that there'd been an accident, pulled over to help this person, realized that there was no accident, but this person was in medical distress. Gave Judy something to eat, called 911. 911 told them to stop feeding her. The ambulance showed up, gave Judy some glucose to get her back. Made sure she got to a restaurant. Judy refused to be transported, which was okay. Made sure she got to a restaurant and had a meal. And then Judy was on her way home. But the amazing part about this, God again is working here. This guardian angel of Judy's was coming into Winnipeg, and she never goes that way. She always goes straight up the highway into Winnipeg, but this time something told her to make a turn and to turn onto the Perimeter Highway. And if she hadn't have turned onto the perimeter highway, she never would have run into Judy that day. And this story could have ended up completely different. But God is working on us all the time. So my story continues. After about 3 months in hospital, I was starting to improve. They moved me to rehab. And the first thing they told me, that's where I met Phil, of course. But the first thing they told me was they put me into a room with 3 other guys, and that was where I stayed. And the next day, I met up with a social worker, and she wanted to know how things were going and just getting the roundup of things. And she says to me, I said to her, she said, is there anything else I can do for you? And I said, yeah. She said, you can get me a private room. I said, last night the guy left his TV on all night and kept me awake. And she said, there's no private rooms in rehab. And I said, okay, whatever. So I went back to my room, and the next night the guy left his TV on all night and kept me awake. So I really hadn't slept for 2 nights. The next morning, the nurse comes up to me and he says, I have some good news and bad news. And I said, so what's the good news? He says, you're getting a private room. And I said, oh. I said, I thought there was no private rooms in rehab. And he says, well, that's the bad news. I said, so what's the bad news? And he says, well, you have a urinary infection that we can't treat. And we don't want you giving it to anybody else. And I said, okay. And I said, so what's the risk with this with this urinary infection? And he says, nothing. I said, so it's not affecting my health at all? And he says, no. And I said, okay. So what's the bad news? So I ended up getting my own private room. There was a little bit of things to it. People had to be gowned up and wear gloves when they came in, but eventually that kind of stopped because people realized that unless they were dealing with my urine, they were not going to get this infection. I ended up spending 4 months in the rehab unit of Health Sciences Centre. I took my first steps in December, mid-December, and my first steps, I was wearing sweatpants. I stood up on a parallel bars thing, and the first thing that happened was my pants fell to the ground, and that's because I'd lost so much weight. Luckily, I was wearing shorts at the time. My physiotherapist quickly raised them, and everybody had a bit of a good laugh. There was a device called what I called the Jolly Jumper, and if anybody had kids in the 80s, they had a Jolly Jumper, and it was a thing that hung from the ceiling, and you were on this bouncy thing, and that just helped you to strengthen your legs, and it was actually amazing. But I was getting stronger and stronger and stronger, and I'd gone from being paralyzed to being up and about in about 7 months. So the fun thing that I always talk about is touch your nose. So it's so easy to do, but you never know how many times your nose itches until you actually cannot scratch it. And I'm telling you, your nose itches a lot. So I was eventually released from hospital March the 6th, 2020, after 7 months. And if March 6th, 2020 doesn't mean anything, it was just in time for the COVID shutdown. So I'd spent 7 months in hospital. We went to church 2 times, and then we were locked down completely, on and off for about the next 2 years. It was just terrible because I just felt like I was still in hospital. So eventually I had to go back to work. I lost my disability insurance, and I went back to work, and I was working from home, and I was working for Rogers, a major phone company in Canada. And I took all sorts of calls, talked to all sorts of people, but there was one call that stuck in my mind. The man was telling me he was getting new television service, and he was telling me that he had no way to answer his door because he was in a wheelchair. So he had to know exactly when this person was coming to install his television so that he could have somebody there. And I said, oh, I feel for you. I said, I was in a wheelchair for a while. He says, well, I've been in a wheelchair for 18 years. And I said, oh, I'm really, really sorry. I asked him what had happened, and he said he got an illness that paralyzed him. And I said, that's the same thing that happened to me, but I said, I'm out of the wheelchair, I'm still in recovery. I said, what was the illness? And he said it was GBS. And I said, wow. I said, okay. I said, I have GBS also. And I said, I used to be a long distance truck driver. He used to be a long distance truck driver, and he got it while he was driving, but his came on really, really quick. In the space of hours, he went from being fully active to being paralyzed, and he's never walked again. So I think of that man, 18 years. Well, now it's, if he's still alive, it would be about 20 years. He spent that 20 years in a wheelchair. I am very, very blessed to be able to walk around, to tell my story, like I said, in churches all around Canada, I hope. So February 17th, 2024, my story was told on It Is Written Canada. That's on CTV, it's on YouTube, it is on all sorts of different platforms. It has been seen by more than 4 million people, is what I was told by the host of the show. It's really uplifting. If you want to search it up, it's listed as A Trucker's Tale of Redemption. It is on YouTube, and it tells a little bit more of my story, but it also has this wonderful blessed hosts that really are great people. So it's a great story. So this journey has been the hardest journey of my life. You can see me there in the different parts of my life, with my church friends at the bottom, with my family up at the top there. I am so blessed to be able to be here to tell this story today. I hope that you got a blessing out of it. I have my blog there. I try to be active. Unfortunately, I'm not as active on my blog as I used to be, but there is my blog story there. And I really hope that you enjoyed listening to this. I hope you share it. And if you have any questions or comments, my email is listed there. I would love if you would be in touch with me, because I would really, really love to tell you more or answer any of the questions that you may have. Thank you for listening. God bless, and have a great day.